Hello, everyone. My name is Sophie Thomashausen. I'm a legal researcher at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. And today I'll be answering all your questions, to the extent that I can, in relation to the readings and coursework for week 11, which has covered quite a bit of work in relation to investing in investing and shared use of infrastructure and integrated corridor approaches, which take into account both infrastructure, but also water resources and forest management and communities, as Michael Stanley spoke about, and also other ways of financing infrastructure development, such as the resources for infrastructure investment that we saw with the last short clip in your course session for this week. So I'm just looking to see if there are any questions. Okay, now I think I'm properly online. So let me see which questions I have so far. Okay, there is one question I see. Can we deduce from countries such as Algeria or Venezuela who didn't invest their extractive resources rent in adequate sustainable investment are those who are at present suffering from the low oil price? I think every country that is a resource-rich country reliant on oil is suffering from the low oil prices at this stage. Some countries who have just planned for these spikes in oil are in a better position to deal with this than others. So yes, countries like Algeria and Venezuela did not properly invest in the long-term infrastructure, health, education, physical infrastructure, and also did not put money aside to balance the budgets in times of low oil prices. So yes, unfortunately, countries that have not planned to properly use their oil gains in times of high prices are now suffering, especially in times of low prices. Let me just check if I haven't been. Is everyone hearing me? There's a great question here. Why some countries import cement 3 times more expensive? Why not produce their cement? I guess clay is widespread everywhere. So, okay, it sounds like I am online. So this question it's a very good question. Cement in particular, given how heavy it is a perfect, it's a perfect industry, building materials in general, to actually produce locally rather than have to import. So when a country thinks of creating economic linkages to its extractive sector, one of those linkages that we learned about last week is consumption linkages, which is increasing consumption of local of locally produced goods and services. And what we found is that governments should really focus on two types of commodities and resources that can be produced locally. One is agriculture, and investment in small-scale agriculture can be really beneficial because it provides for consumption of local produce. And the other is building materials, such as cement, which is very heavy and is not that difficult to produce. If the stone is available, it would be a very good industry to support locally, so that the building sector can be encouraged, and during construction of mines and related infrastructure and buildings, the cement can be sourced locally. So yes, I don't know why it does not make sense for cement to be imported by the virtue of the fact that it's 3 times more expensive in some cases, and also it's very heavy and it's a waste to be importing, and it could really be produced locally. I hope that addresses the question. Okay, I have a question here. Are there any examples of where or how an extractive contract could successfully override existing laws or regulations? Wouldn't most legal frameworks automatically make any such contracts null and void? Unfortunately, we see this quite often in contracts, particularly from the early 2000s, when some legal regimes were considered to be unstable or a little bit risky. We see a clause called a stabilization clause. And stabilization clauses serve many purposes, in large part to reduce the risk for investors. But but a number of contracts actually do have such clauses, and they do effectively take the contract, certain provisions of the contract, out of the legal system by, for example, stating that the fiscal provisions in the contract will override those of the country, or that the law at the time the contract is signed will prevail, even if there are subsequent changes in law. So yes, logic would have that the laws of the country should apply to a resource project, but in effect, contracts with extensive stabilization clauses do have the effect of overriding law. So, which is another reason why at Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, when working with governments, we are trying to promote the idea of tenders, of transparent tender processes for resources, so that as one alternative or one solution, and the other is that as many provisions governing resource extraction as possible should be in the law, so that very little can be negotiated in the contract. And if there is a good law that conforms with international standards, it's very hard for an investor to say that, or to argue that there should be a very lengthy stabilization clause in the contract. Having said that, I don't think we will see stabilization clauses go away altogether, because some jurisdictions are just very risky, and as a means to ensure that they do attract investments, particularly when commodity prices start to recover again, they may need a minimum level of stabilization. So in this case, when we work with governments, what we do is we encourage them to agree to some kind of stabilization form, but really minimal. So if they are pressured into having a stabilization clause, the ideal stabilization clause would be limited to only fiscal provisions. So it would not affect, would not include any restrictions on the government to change environmental, social, or labor, or any other types of laws. Those should all be applying to the contract. And in relation to any stabilization of the fiscal clauses, which give the investor comfort that the tax regime that will be applying to the investment will not change for a certain number of years, to include a sunset clause. So basically, what that means is that the stabilization clause for the fiscal provisions will only apply for a certain period of time, usually long enough for the investor to recoup his costs of the investment. One must remember that mining and oil and gas investments are very capital intensive with a heavy sunken upfront cost. So to find that balance between protecting the investor and protecting the interest of the country, we can find a balance where the stabilization clause is limited to the fiscal provisions and then only applies for so long as the investor needs to recoup investment costs. So that's a long-winded way of saying that yes, unfortunately, we do have these stabilization clauses that effectively mean that contracts or certain provisions in the contracts are beyond and outside the legal system. Okay, there's another question from the forum. What states need to do to achieve the SDGs with support from natural resources? Now that is a very vast question. And what I would do here for this question is actually refer you to a recent report that has come out that was authored by the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, the World Economic Forum, SPSN, which is the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and the UNDP, and it's called Mapping Mining to the Sustainable Development Goals. And what it does is it actually takes all 17 Sustainable Development Goals and shows how each one applies to the mining sector, either because mining negatively affects or hampers the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal, for example, on the environmental side or on the water side, or because mining and the revenues it generates in a country can actually promote the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it provides case studies and it shows how the Sustainable Development Goals can be achieved using mining. So I would refer you to the report. You can find it on the USTSN website, or if you just Google mapping mining and the SDGs, you should be able to get it. Okay, let's see the next question. Question for the forum. Are there any examples of where or how an extractive contract? Okay, that one I've answered. Another question. If there is a usual percentage of the revenue from natural resources that has been noticed to be enough for leading to actual improvements, but still be relatively safe in the case of a developing country. I'm not quite sure what this question means, but if it's in the context of public investment, I think it really depends on a particular country, on what their public investment requirements are, on the current state of their infrastructure and their public sector. Of course, for countries where there is a big infrastructure gap, a lot of public investment would potentially be required. And in terms of the optimal point, it's very hard to say. It also would depend on how big the extractive sector is in a country, and what the commodity prices are at that time. So it's very much country specific and time specific. And that's what makes this so difficult, is that in the planning that a government does, it really needs flexible policy mechanisms to decide what its national development goals are, how the resources sector can help achieve those goals, and from a budgetary perspective, having the mechanism to allow for fluctuations between priorities, bearing in mind that if you have a greenfield project or you have a reserve that still needs to be developed, it takes a number of years for the revenues to actually start coming in. First of all, the infrastructure to extract the commodity has to be built or rehabilitated, and then the investor sometimes needs to recoup its costs, which means that the first 3 years are not really generating profit, especially in times of low commodity prices. So that needs to be taken into account, the lag between signing a contract or tendering a resource and revenues actually coming in. And also, as we've seen now with the commodity price slump, there needs to be flexibility to account for times when commodity prices are high and it can be a windfall to the government, and commodity prices are low, and the government may have allotted more in a budget in a particular year than there actually is. And then, as readings from this week and last week have shown, the government then has to apply various mechanisms to decide what to do. And often that's cutting back on a particular budget may not be the best solution, or may not be feasible, because infrastructure investments, for example, are multi-year projects and need sustained infrastructure investments. But borrowing is also not the best situation, as we've seen with all the recent debt crises. So that is where the idea of some limited savings through natural resource funds, for example, would come into play, or the resource for infrastructure deals we saw from this readings. Let's see. There's a question: how can local communities use any revenues they do receive to develop alternative, successful local industries, especially ones that are sustainable and can grow? Can you walk us through how they can analyze and select what to concentrate on? That is a very good question, and a very difficult one. The way this would usually be approached or started is, you've mentioned local communities, and there are sometimes a certain number of funds that are channeled directly into a local community through a community development agreement or certain provisions. I'll take the question to be a little bit broader, possibly for like a region where the local government is actually administering funds. And then a good starting point is to do a food social impact assessment to establish a baseline for the local economic conditions, really see what the needs are, and where the gaps are, and what is required. You could say everything is needed. We need water infrastructure, we need schools, we need this, we need that, but knowing exactly how many people there are in an area, what is their level of current level of income, what is their education level, what are their livelihoods based on, and having an understanding of the local area will help not only the local government, but also the extractive companies and donors better understand what they're doing and what types of policy mechanisms would best be suited to ensuring that an investment in resource extraction in that area can lead to sustainable development. And then, as we have seen from the readings, there are many ways in which extractives can promote sustainable development. One is, as you suggest, through the reinvestment of the revenues from that have been raised from taxes. But the other is really ensuring that the resource extraction, the investment, is used to diversify an economy. So in terms of spatial linkages, as we saw from Three Toledano's short webinar, you can see where there is scope for shared use infrastructure, which could be rail and ports in a bulk commodities mine, although that is actually the hardest type of infrastructure to share. It could be benefiting from roads, which will facilitate all kinds of businesses, especially when you have farmers that need to bring their produce to the market. Having good roads, reliable roads, can really help facilitate their travel back and forth. So it could be some investment in infrastructure, which local communities or local governments can use some of its revenues to improve. But you could also work with the mine to see what routes will the mine be using, even if they are building a railway, they will still need to build some roads, often alongside the railway and also around their sites. And there may be some synergies there for the road construction, where certain roads also benefit the local population, and there could be some negotiation to ensure that the mining company is maintaining those roads. Could be power. So power is also a big contributor of economic growth, and there may be some synergies between the power requirements of the mine and also the power needs of a local community. So if there's a local power producer, it may make sense for, depending on the situation, for the mining company to invest or become the anchor customer of the local power plant, so that that infrastructure improves, and then the mining company could even help to extend the breadth of coverage of power to local communities. Or if that's not an option, it may make sense with a collaboration between the local government, donors, possibly the central government, to for the mine to build a power project with extra capacity. And the extra capacity could then be used to supply some power to local communities. And with that power, you could then have great synergies to to spur on other types of jobs. And there's also a job creation through ensuring that some of the goods and services that the mining companies or the oil and gas companies require are sourced locally, or that some of the beneficiation from some of the refinement of the products is also done locally. But really understanding if any of those opportunities for sharing infrastructure are, whether the costs are less than the benefits, will require an understanding of the current situation, both on the ground and of the situation of the mine. Then there are other opportunities for investing in education and in health. And then again, those are longer term investments, incredibly important. They need to be aligned with the national development plans of a country, and require steadfast investment over the years. So the revenues may take a while to accrue, and it's you need a long-term plan. So in brief, I would say you need the impact assessments, social impact assessment of local economic conditions, both of the community, well, especially of the community and the needs, also seeing what the mine needs are, an environmental impact assessment to see what the impact on the environment will be and how that should be factored into all these plans, and local development plans to really understand what the industries are in a particular region and how the extractive sector fits into that, and what kind of integrated approach you can have to see that you benefit from the extractives. I'll just say a brief word about community development agreements. So in some countries, it's required that a community development agreement be entered into with a local community, or that a certain percentage of revenues are channeled to a local community. In some places, it's not required, but companies voluntarily enter into them. And then there may be some model community development agreements that are normal. In some places, it's more of a negotiation, and that will set out what types of benefits accrue for the local community. But again, I don't think there is a model, one type fits all for every community out there. It really needs to be based on what the local circumstances are, which requires some assessment at the beginning. And then ideally what you're doing is you're taking those first assessments as a baseline and working off of those. So every few years you can see, what was the baseline? Have we improved from there? Do we need to make some adjustments and move on? So whatever policy or strategy is used, it needs some flexibility to change over time. Resource investments are long-term. It could be 30, 40, 50 years. And it's very hard at the beginning of the 50-year period to say this is what's going to happen for the next 50 years. It's unrealistic. You don't know where commodity prices will go. You don't. Sometimes you have a local community which is identified, and in the construction period or the initial years, you'll have a huge influx of people from elsewhere in the country or regionally, which will again change what your original estimates were, and then that might decrease of the construction. So you really need to have flexibility in the policy instruments and then what you decide. Yeah, there's one question: public and private partnerships issues when there is a heavy bureaucracy. I don't know if that's a question more than a statement, but yes, having a very complex bureaucracy can mean that public-private partnerships are more difficult to forge, which is really why when a country is seeking to encourage investment and diversification from extractive sector investment, it should look at its laws and the legal framework governing such an investment, and also public-private partnerships to streamline it to help. What can you do with a heavy bureaucracy? I think encouraging transparency of the processes really helps. A bureaucracy may be very onerous, but if there is transparency as to what the requirements are, and they do not change from one project to the next, and depending on who is assisting you in the bureaucracy, that goes a long way towards facilitating public-private partnerships, even when there are very onerous requirements. Okay. Oh, sorry. I saw I should be highlighting the questions. Apologies, I did not do that. Get on. Okay, another question. In a new situation where coal is extracted at an area and used only to fuel nearby power plants producing electricity, what could be the possible shared use infrastructure applications, and how these could help develop and diversify the economy? Okay, so you're saying you have coal plants and they're only being used to power local power plants. Presumably, those local power plants are then servicing the local area. So there may not be that may already be a shared use to a certain extent. Where you could have other shared use is where, although coal is being used for local power plants, there's still a big gap in coverage of power. So there may be identified local communities or industries in the area that are not benefiting from the coal-fired power plants in the area. So in such a case, it may make sense for some shared use, but again, it would be a cost-benefit analysis. So let me see. It's probably unlikely that there is much shared use in that, because the coal is already going to the local power plant. What you could see there is you have to look at what the power needs are of the mining company. Is the mining company then sourcing its power from one of those local power plants? If so, it may already be investing in the capacity of the local power plants. So that is a shared use arrangement where the mining companies that are providing the coal to the power plants are also the anchor customers of the local power plants. Or if the mining company has its own power plant using its coal under its concession area, there are communities around there that do not have sufficient power. You could then, there could be shared use if the mining company is then directly supplying local communities the power. I just like to say a point here on timing of negotiating shared use. And for a mining company, you really want to be negotiating shared use at the outset of the project. So if it's a greenfield project, meaning that it's a new exploration, when the government starts the negotiations with a mining project, that's when you would want to have the discussions about shared use. Or if there is a tender, you would want certain requirements on shared use in the tender document before the mine has actually completed the design of the mining project and all its feasibility studies, and before it's constructed its infrastructure. If a government comes and requires shared use, once the infrastructure has already been built, it is very difficult to impose shared use because the mining company may not have thought about shared use and may not have built in enough capacity for the shared use. So it may not be economically feasible for a mine to then share the infrastructure with surrounding communities. So once a mine is actually up and running, the only time where you could really require shared use is if there's a change of circumstance or the mine wants to increase production and is possibly having to upgrade or expand its infrastructure. Then, as part of the expansion plans, you could negotiate some shared use. Okay, I've answered that one. Okay, are there any new questions? Let me look. There's a question on the SPGs, and I do believe that they will be covered next week. But again, I do encourage you to look at that report on mapping mining to the Sustainable Development Goals, which is very informative. Some very interesting case studies also on structure and how mining can promote, how there can be shared use arrangements between the mining sector and local authorities or the community. And in this regard, I would also point you to some of the work we have done at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. Over the last 5 years, we've engaged in a number of projects looking at kinds of regulatory models and enabling conditions to promote shared use, and also what should be taken into account in terms of cost-benefit analysis to really evaluate whether shared use makes sense. As Corinne said in her in the short video clip, it's shared use doesn't make sense for all types of infrastructure, for all types of projects. And there is really a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be done, because for rail and ports in particular, there are high coordination costs. The more users you have on the rail, the more difficult it becomes to make sure that there are not big delays on the rail, and it becomes expensive. And also railway lines to build are very expensive and intensive. So if a mine is being required to build more capacity into the rail, that means that its costs are much higher, and that may result in a lessening of the fiscal revenues that are coming into the country. So a country really wants to see, how much revenue is it hoping to generate from a project, and would it be willing to trade off receiving some of that revenue to having the infrastructure on the ground? So really be mindful of the cost-benefit analysis. And if you are interested in reading more, go to our website, the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, and check out what we have done on leveraging mining-related infrastructure for economic development. We have 5 excellent reports on looking at each of the 5 major types of infrastructure and what the opportunities and costs are on sharing it. Okay, let's see. I think I've answered all the questions here. I'll see. I'll see if there are any more questions coming in. So I hope I've answered the questions appropriately. If you do have any follow-up questions, please list them. One thing that I found interesting was in Michael Stanley's discussion of integrated spatial planning. He spoke about infrastructure and spatial linkages, but then also forest management and water management. And when we think about a resource corridor, the anchor infrastructure investment is generally the rail or port structure. So then we're talking about a bulk commodity mine, which is generally iron ore or coal or copper. And in such a case, you have the railway line, which, if it's multi-purpose, will allow for other types of non-mining commodities to be transported on the rail, and possibly also passengers. And then you can have all types of growth of other industries alongside this corridor. But as Michael Stanley correctly pointed out, this really goes hand in hand with forest management and the environmental impact of such a resource corridor and the types of economic activities that it incentivizes, and also water use, which is an incredibly important issue. Also from the mining perspectives, as mines use a lot of water in the operations. Again, this varies from commodity type and operation type. But for both commodities, a lot of water is actually used for dust suppression. Whereas in copper and gold mining operations, a lot of water is actually required for the cleaning, the beneficiation, and processing of the ore. And in addition to the water needs, mines potentially have a very negative impact on the quality of surrounding water courses. So water issues are very important from the mining perspective, but also other types of economic activities in that may be along the integrated resource corridor do have an effect on the environment. Agriculture in particular is also very water intensive, and fertilizers are also critically polluting water sources. And as communities, as you have an influx of people to work in these new economic opportunities on a resource corridor, they also have greater consumptive requirements for water along the resource corridor. So water management is very important. And again, that is understanding what resources are there. Are there aquifers underneath the resource corridor? Are there streams that are fed by the aquifers? How much rainfall is in the area? What are the expected fluxes of water availability from owing to climate change? And then what kind of infrastructure do you need to conserve and to treat water? Maybe a need for storage, and also water treatment. And in terms of water treatment, that's where there are potential synergies with the mining sector. So mines, although they may require a lot of water, they don't actually need clean water for most of the operations. They can use wastewater or other types of not clean water. And if there are the right types of regulations, they should be treating all of their water. So they can actually reuse a lot of their water. And to the extent that they are treating the water, they could actually also supply it to other water users, either for drinking purposes or for other industrial purposes or for farming purposes. So there is really an opportunity when you have a mine to see what synergies there are, what the impact of the mine will be on the water sources, and if there is some scope for ensuring that a mine minimizes its water footprint. So it's using very little fresh water, it's recycling a lot of its water, and it's not discharging any of its waste into water, and it's efficiently managing its tailings ponds. But also what the scope is for the mine to actually supply access to clean water to surrounding communities, whether that be sending water to a local authority. If there's a local water authority, the mine could actually pipe water to the local authority that then distributes it to local communities, or if it's providing it to communities directly. Or if a mine is sourcing some of its water from the local authority, it could again invest in the infrastructure of the local power utility. So there are many opportunities, and mines actually sometimes have too much water that they need to get rid of. So especially for open pits and also for underground mines, the deeper the mine goes, once it hits the water table under the water, it's actually extracting a lot of water from the mine, which is called dewatering. And this water mines should be required to reuse this water in their operations rather than just throwing it out, discharging it into the environment, and then sourcing new water. And this water also provides the opportunity to supply that water, once treated, to local communities. So while water is often overlooked in terms of shared use infrastructure, it's a very important, it's a hugely important resource, and there are many opportunities to see what synergies there are with mining. Another one that we spoke about is ICT, Internet and Telecommunications. And that's sometimes overlooked, but actually that is one of the easiest types of infrastructure to share around a mining site. And that is because mines require communications. Traditionally, they use some satellite services, but increasingly they are using cell phones, and they do need some form of telecommunication. And the world now cannot live without internet, as we see from this entire MOOC. So if a mine is requiring ICT services, seeing how the mine's requirements can also benefit other communities is a very pertinent question. And one other point that Corinne raised is the right of way, which is very important and also linked to ICT. So if there's a railway line, a government should ensure that it owns the right of way of railway or a road, which means that the lands around the railway should not belong to the mine, but should be so that the mine controls what goes on there. If the government owns that area, it could decide that power lines or ICT lines, water lines are laid along that railway, which is called the economies of scope. And that can drastically reduce the cost of other types of infrastructure. Because as Corinne said in her talk, when it comes to ICT infrastructure, one of the biggest costs is actually laying down the pipeline because of the excavation. And now if you already have a corridor and you already have pipelines and an area where the pipes can be laid or the cables can be laid, you've drastically reduced the costs of implementing that infrastructure. And also land issues are a huge issue when it comes to concession agreements and also to railways. When one thinks of a railway line, one thinks of 2-3 meters in length, maybe 15-20 feet that the railway line takes. But a railway corridor can be as wide as 50 meters, and that spans many hundreds of kilometers from a mine all the way to the port. And taking away that land can be very difficult. You may have, if a new railway line is being built, that railway may be going on farmland or local community lands, and there are many rights implicated. And that becomes an issue with other types of infrastructure too. If water lines, power lines, or ICT cables be laid over long tracts of land, digging the land to be able to lay those pipelines becomes an issue when people are living on that land or it is farmland. So that's why it's very important for the government to maintain the right of way of types of longitudinal infrastructure, because once the land is already owned by the government and there are no people living there potentially, it may be easier to lay other types of infrastructure on that corridor, on that right of way. Okay, let's see if there are any other questions. Okay, I don't see any other questions. I'll just wait online to see if any other questions come up. And please also feel free to email me if you have any questions on the subject matter this week. And my email address is available on CCSI's website. And please also do look at our resources that we have on the website. Michael Stanley mentioned a great resource, the EI Sourcebook, which provides a lot of information on investment in extractives, local content, diversification. There was a question yesterday about where more information can be found about Botswana as an example of a successful case. If you go to the EI Sourcebook, you can actually find some information on that. And then I would also like to point you to another resource, which is the Negotiation Support Portal. And you can find that at negotiationsupport.org. And this is a site which has been made with government in mind and also civil society. And it provides a kind of a one-stop shop for information when you are looking at a natural resource investment. So on this website, you have a roadmap which takes you through all the different stages of investment, starting at setting the legal and policy framework and what you should be thinking about with the national development plans, and then seeing how a particular investment in a natural resource fits into that national development plan. And it also takes you through the types of laws and policies that are required to frame a natural resource investment, and the types of issues that you should be thinking about. From there, it takes you to the types of issues and governments and civil society should be thinking about before entering into a contract negotiation or a tender process. So that's looking at the types of assessments that would ideally be done at this stage: environmental impact assessments, social impact assessments, human rights impact assessments, the types of issues to consider for shared use, and also issues like how do you prepare for a negotiation? How do you assemble a negotiation team? What should the competition be? What types of preparation do you need to do for the negotiation? And then there's a section on how to build the contract negotiation itself. And there are resources on model provisions and different topics that you would read up about, the types of support you would need in the contract negotiation. And finally, there is a section on monitoring and implementation. As Michael Stanley said, the success of infrastructure projects and integrated resource corridors is largely dependent on how well the implementation goes and the monitoring. So once a contract is signed, that is not the end of the story. In a way, that's only the beginning of the next chapter to make sure that an investment is actually properly implemented and that unforeseen circumstances are properly addressed. So in this line, it's very important to have good governance structures, to have transparency, and also to have the capacity to implement the project. Having contracts publicly available is very helpful. And we are working on a project, resourcecontracts.org, and also openlandcontracts.org, which posts natural resource contracts online and provides annotations of the key provisions so that the terms become more accessible to everyone that is not a lawyer. So if you're interested in a stabilization clause, for example, you can go to resourcecontracts.org, choose your country, choose your contract, and then there's a little button and you press stabilization clause, and it will take you to where in the country there is potentially a provision that is freezing some of the provisions that may supersede local or national laws. So we have all these resources, and another reason why it's so important that contracts are transparent is that all the parties know what the obligations are. One issue that we see is that a contract is entered into and many different government agencies are implicated. They should be the Ministry of Water, the Environmental Protection Agency, Ministry of Mining, Ministry of Public Works, if there's infrastructure. There are many industries and ministries that are affected, but they may not know what is going on in this particular project, whether they have any obligations that they should be monitoring or that they themselves should be doing. So having a very transparent process with a transparent contract can help in the implementation process. So yeah, please take a look at the negotiation support portal, which is at negotiationsupport.org. You can also Google negotiation support negotiation support portal, and take a look at this roadmap, which sets out all the phases of an investment project. The portal also has some other very useful resources in terms of there's one section where you can search, for example, local content or human rights or environmental issues or setting the legal policy framework. There are various things you can click and it will narrow down your research for you, and it provides you with a list of up-to-date resources which are not too academic. We don't have academic journal articles there, but rather practical resources and toolkits to help you think about or navigate an issue. There is also a section on support providers. So organizations such as the World Bank or the African Legal Support Facility or the International Senior Lawyers Project that provide pro bono support or support on a non-for-profit basis at the different stages of the investment process. So you have a list of relevant support providers there, and you can also search among them according to various criteria and see if it would make sense to engage in some technical support. And then finally, there is also a section on short training courses, which again are provided on a not-for-profit basis, and that can help you build your skills in various aspects of an investment, for an extractive investment, an infrastructure investment, and also investments in land and agriculture. So we have all the great repository of information for you to take a look at that can be a place if you have a question about something to see if there's a resource or to see who you can reach out to for support, or if you would just like to understand more about the investment process and the types of issues to think about in investments. I would encourage you to do that. Okay, it looks like I have one more question. When is the best time during a project timeline to develop a strategy about the closing of a mine, restoring the landscape, and also helping the local economy mitigate the effects of dependence on the mining activities for a long term? This is a very good question. And it is something that you actually need to be thinking about from day one. And what we are increasingly seeing in some jurisdictions is that when you apply for a mining license, you already need to prepare a mine closure report that sets out how you are going to go about potentially restoring the environment or mitigating the impacts of the environmental impacts of the mine on its surrounding environment. And so I would really say, as early as possible, these issues should be thought about. And then if you have annual or 5-year reporting requirements, the mine closure plan should be updated according to how a mine is progressing. And then definitely a few years in the run-up to a mine closure, there should be accelerated thought and planning for the mine closure. Different countries have different rules. In some places, a mine may be required to restore the natural habitat, in other places not. Contamination of water is a huge issue because sometimes the mine closes and it looks like they have adequately prepared for the closure. But then, because of the excavation, some of the remnants of the mining results in acid mine drainage in the water. So you do want to make sure that these issues have been addressed and thought about in environmental impact assessments from as early as possible, and that the mine is liable after mine closure. In terms of helping the local economy, I would bear in mind that there are cycles. There's usually a huge boom in local employment very early on when a mine is in the construction phase and a lot of workers are required. After that, mining is very capital intensive, so the employment generated from mining increases a lot after 5 or 6 years of mine development when the mine is in operation. And where there is shared use, you really have to think about how to make sure that any shared infrastructure arrangements are sustainable. So, for example, if a mine is providing water to a surrounding community, it may not be, local communities may not like this at the beginning, but it actually makes sense to require local communities to be paying a small cost for the water or for the power in a similar situation that covers the operation and maintenance of providing that water or power. Because this will ensure that when the mine leaves, the local community is accustomed to paying that amount, and if local community members have been used or have been involved in the operation of that kind of infrastructure, that infrastructure can become sustainable after a mine closes shop. So when it comes to mining communities providing infrastructure, it's really important to implement sustainable models for the operation of that infrastructure while the mine is still there. And then helping the local economy mitigate the effects. Otherwise, this is really where economic diversification strategies come in. And you had the lectures last week on establishing linkages to the extractive sector. So really want to make sure that from day one, strategies are in place to try and ensure that other industries are being built around the mining sector that can then be repositioned. So initially, you'll be having service providers that supply the inputs to the mining sector. But as the economy grows, those types of services may be able to reposition to support other types of economic activity. So I would say from day one, or from even before, when the government is thinking about natural resource extraction or the extractive sectors and how it fits into a national development plan, needs to be thinking about how it can use those investments as a springboard for the rest of the economy. So it really is not dependent on the resources, but it uses it as a kickstart to ensure that other sectors of the economy are functioning. That changes from country to country. For example, Chile invested in agriculture and its wine business, and Malaysia is now in stage 3 of an industrialization program, which it has used its commodities to kickstart and to develop. And so it is investing in the high-tech sector. There really are very different strategies, but this constantly needs to be kept in mind that when it comes to the extractive sector, it's a finite resource that is being extracted, and it's only there for a certain amount of time. So if the reserves say there are 50 years of reserves, a government needs to be thinking long term about what kind of strategies it can implement to survive and to do economically well after the extractives are no longer there. Okay. I think that's it, and it's now 10 o'clock, so we are at the end of our time. Thank you very much for staying on, and I wish you good luck for the course. Thank you.